Blackridge does not want our money anymore, Margaret Whitmore said, folding her jeweled hands upon the dining table. His Grace wants you. The words fell into the room with the soft finality of snow covering a grave. Clara Whitmore stood beside the cold hearth of Whitmore House, her fingers resting against the back of an empty chair, though she did not sit. No one had invited her to. Outside, February wind pressed against the windows hard enough to make the old glass tremble, and every candle on the table burned low, as if even the flames had learned to economize in a house where everything of value had already been sold. Her father sat at the far end of the table with his head bowed, one hand wrapped around a glass he had not lifted in 10 minutes. Henry Whitmore had once spoken with the confidence of a gentleman whose name still meant something in Virginia society. Now his collar hung loose around his throat, his hair lay uncombed at his temples, and his silence was worse than any confession. Clara looked at the paper lying between them. Thick cream paper, black wax, the seal of the Duke of Blackridge pressed into it like a wound. "I do not understand," she said, though she understood perfectly. Margaret's mouth curved, not quite into a smile. "Then allow me to be plain. Your father's debt has passed beyond repayment. The banks have refused him. The creditors are circling. Blackridge purchased the full amount this morning." Clara felt the room narrow around her, the dark mahogany walls drawing closer, the portraits of dead Whitmores staring down as if they had all turned witness against her. "And what has that to do with me?" Margaret lifted a second paper from beside her plate. "His Grace has agreed to delay legal action on the estate if you present yourself at Blackridge Hall before midnight and accept temporary residence under his protection." Protection. Clara almost laughed, but the sound never reached her throat. In her stepmother's mouth, the word had the shine of polished silver and the smell of a locked door. "You mean he has bought me with the debt?" Her father flinched. Only slightly. Only enough to prove he was still alive beneath his shame. Margaret's eyes hardened. "Do not make this vulgar. You are not being sold. You are being useful." Clara turned to her father then. The candlelight showed the tremor in his lower lip, the ruin of a man too weak to save his daughter and too proud to beg her forgiveness. "Father," she said quietly, "did you sign this?" His fingers tightened around the glass. For a moment, she thought he might speak. For a moment, the little girl inside her remembered his hand guiding hers across the garden path, his voice telling her that a Whitmore never abandoned blood. Then he looked away. That was the answer. Something inside Clara went very still. Not broken. Not yet. Only silent in the way a frozen lake is silent before it cracks. Margaret slid the pen across the table. "The carriage leaves in 20 minutes. If you refuse, the sheriff will come by morning. Your father will lose the house, the land, and what remains of his name." Clara looked at the pen. Its gold nib caught the candlelight like a tiny blade. She thought of her mother's room, locked since her death. She thought of the piano sold last winter, the silver gone by Christmas, the servants dismissed one by one until Whitmore House became less a home than a body being stripped for burial. She thought of the man waiting in the north, Ethan Hawthorne, Duke of Blackridge, known from Boston to the Carolina coast as the Frost Duke. A man who never raised his voice because he had never needed to. Men paid him, feared him, cursed him in private, and came to him anyway when ruin stood at the door. Now ruin had taken Clara's name in its hand and written it beneath his. She picked up the pen. Margaret's smile returned, thin and satisfied. "Good girl." Clara paused. Slowly, she lifted her eyes. "Do not call me that." The room seemed to inhale. Even her father looked up. Clara bent over the paper and signed her name with a steady hand. Clara Evelyn Whitmore. Not because she consented. Not because she forgave them. Not because she was afraid of the Duke of Blackridge. She signed because if someone had to walk into the dark to keep the last stones of Whitmore House from falling before dawn, it would be her. When she finished, she set the pen down gently. "Tell His Grace," she said, reaching for her worn gloves, "that the debt is on its way." The carriage left Whitmore House with no farewell except the scrape of iron wheels over frozen gravel. Clara sat alone inside, her small trunk pressed against her knees, her gloved hands folded so tightly that the seams bit into her fingers. She did not look back when the house disappeared behind the black branches of the sycamores. Looking back belonged to people who expected to return unchanged. By the time the road turned north, The last pale wash of evening had drained from the sky, leaving the countryside silver and blue beneath the moon. Snow began as a whisper, then thickened until the world beyond the carriage window became a blur of white fields, split-rail fences, and bare trees reaching upward like hands that had forgotten how to pray. The driver said little. Twice, Clara heard him curse under his breath as the horses slowed against the rising wind. Blackridge Hall stood nearly 30 miles from Whitmore House, past the old mill road, and beyond a stretch of hills where polite families did not travel after dark unless duty, death, or desperation commanded them. Clara supposed she had all three for company. She reached into the pocket of her coat and touched the only thing she had taken from her mother's locked room before leaving. A small silver ribbon clasp, tarnished at the edges, engraved with the initials E.W. Evelyn Whitmore. Clara had no memory of her mother's voice, only the scent of lavender and folded linens, the softness of a portrait smile, and the strange ache that came from loving someone mostly through absence. "Almost there, miss," the driver called after what felt like hours. His voice sounded thinner now, swallowed by snow. The carriage climbed a narrow road between walls of dark pine, and then Clara saw it. Blackridge Hall rose from the hillside like a judgment carved out of stone. Its towers were square and severe, its windows tall and mostly unlit, its roofline sharp against the moon. No garland softened the door. No warm lantern welcomed the steps. The whole estate seemed less inhabited than endured. The carriage stopped before the outer gate, and the driver did not move to open her door at once. "I am not taking the horses closer," he said. "The hill is iced over. Main doors are straight ahead, maybe 200 yards. Clara looked through the glass at the long drive, where snow moved in pale sheets across the dark stone. "Very well. Someone will come for your trunk." "No," she said, opening the door before courage could become negotiation. "It is mine." The cold struck her face so sharply that her breath vanished. She stepped down, lifted the small trunk with both hands, and began the walk alone. Each step crunched over ice. Her boots sank into fresh snow. Wind pulled at her coat and lifted loose strands of hair from beneath her bonnet. But she kept moving toward the great doors because there was no dignity in freezing politely outside a prison. Halfway up the drive, she saw a curtain shift in one high window. Someone was watching. By the time she reached the entrance, her arms trembled from the weight of the trunk and her cheeks burned with cold. She raised the brass knocker and let it fall. The sound echoed through the house with a depth that made the silence afterward seem alive. The door opened to reveal an elderly butler in black, his expression composed, though his eyes moved quickly over her wet hem, her reddened hands, and the trunk at her feet. "Miss Whitmore," he said, not asking. "Yes. You are late." Clara felt the snow melting at her collar. "The weather did not consult me." A flicker crossed his face, not amusement exactly, but something near enough to prove the house had not entirely killed human feeling. "This way." He stepped aside. Warm air touched her first, then the scent of old wood, candle wax, and stone that had held winter for generations. The entrance hall stretched upward in shadowed grandeur, its staircase sweeping along the far wall like a dark river frozen mid-turn. Portraits watched from every side. Men in black coats, women in pale silk, children with serious eyes. Clara had the uncomfortable sense of entering a family argument that had been waiting a century for her arrival. At the top of the staircase stood a man. Tall, still, dressed in black, one hand resting upon the carved banister. Candlelight struck the hard line of his face and left his eyes in shadow, but Clara knew him at once. Ethan Hawthorne, Duke of Blackridge. The Frost Duke. He descended slowly, each step measured, his gaze never leaving her. He did not offer a greeting. He did not ask whether she had suffered from the journey. When he reached the foot of the stairs, the butler bowed and disappeared so soundlessly that Clara almost envied him. The Duke looked at the melting snow around the hem of her dress, then at the trunk beside her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Your debt arrived late." Clara should have lowered her eyes. She should have remembered what she was in this house. Instead, she lifted her chin, cold water dripping from the edge of her glove onto the black marble floor. "No, Your Grace," she said. "I arrived. The debt was already here before I was born." For the first time since he had appeared, something moved behind his eyes. Not warmth, not pity, Recognition, perhaps, though of what Clara could not tell. The silence between them lengthened until the candles seemed to tremble with it. Then the Duke turned slightly toward the closed doors beyond the hall. "Take her trunk to the west room," he said, though no servant was visible. Somewhere in the shadows, footsteps obeyed. He looked back at Clara, and the temperature in the hall seemed to fall. "You will come to my study." Clara removed her wet gloves with careful fingers. "Am I being received as a guest or inventoried as collateral?" His gaze sharpened. "That depends entirely on how much truth you can bear tonight." The study doors closed behind Clara with a sound too soft to be called a warning and too final to be called anything else. Ethan Hawthorne crossed the room without haste, moving through the firelight as though the shadows belonged to him by inheritance. His study was vast, paneled in dark walnut, lined from floor to ceiling with legal volumes, estate ledgers, and locked cabinets whose brass handles glinted like watchful eyes. A fire burned in the hearth, yet the room felt no warmer than the hall. Some places did not become kind simply because flame had been permitted to enter them. Clara stood near the doorway, refusing to step deeper until invited. The Duke noticed. Of course he did. Men like him noticed hesitation the way bankers noticed interest. "Sit," he said. "Thank you, but I prefer to stand." That was not a request. "Then I prefer to disobey once before the terms are explained." His hand paused over a stack of papers on the desk. The pause lasted less than a second, but Clara saw it, and in that small fracture she found enough courage to breathe. Ethan turned toward her fully. His face was not cruel in the common way. Cruelty usually had appetite in it, some vulgar pleasure in making another person shrink. His expression held no pleasure. That made it worse. He looked like a man executing a sentence he had written long ago and forgotten how to question. "Your family owes me $72,000, he said, "including interest, legal fees, and the private notes purchased this morning from 3 separate creditors." Clara's fingers curled against the damp wool of her skirt. $72,000. The number was too large to feel real. It did not sound like money. It sounded like a wall being built around her one brick at a time. "My father never told me the sum." "Your father has avoided telling many truths. That does not make me responsible for them." "No," Ethan said, "but it has made you useful to those who are." He drew one document from the stack and laid it on the desk. "This is the agreement your stepmother signed. It places you under my guardianship for 3 months while the estate's legal settlement is suspended." Clara crossed the room then, because fear was easier to bear when one could read the shape of it. The paper was written in careful language, polished enough to hide its ugliness. Temporary residence. Moral supervision. Restriction of correspondence. No unsanctioned travel beyond the grounds. Compliance with household protocols. Clara read each line once, then again, feeling the cold sharpen behind her ribs. "Guardianship," she said. "I am 23 years old, and legally entangled in a debt structure your family created using your name as domestic assurance." That sounds almost civilized when phrased by an attorney. Civilization is often only cruelty with better grammar. She looked up at him then, startled despite herself. For the first time, something like bitterness had entered his voice, and it did not seem directed at her. He took a pen from the silver stand and placed it beside the contract. "If you remain here for 3 months, I will delay all action against Whitmore House. If you attempt to leave, contact outside parties without approval, or interfere with matters beyond your understanding, the protection ends." "Protection again," Clara murmured. What a generous word for a locked gate. His gray eyes narrowed. "You are not a prisoner. Then I may leave?" The silence answered before he did. The fire shifted, sending a brief spill of gold across the desk, touching the black seal at the bottom of the page. "You may leave," Ethan said at last, with full knowledge of what follows. Clara heard her father's silence again. Margaret's satisfied voice. The empty hearth at Whitmore House. She imagined a sheriff on the steps by morning, neighbors watching from behind curtains, the last fragments of her mother's world carried out and sold by strangers. Her throat tightened, but she would not give the Duke the dignity of seeing it. "May I amend one line?" she asked. No, she picked up the pen anyway. Ethan moved one step closer, not touching her, but near enough that she felt the stillness of him beside her shoulder. "Miss Whitmore, I thought you preferred truth." Clara bent over the paper and added a sentence beneath the restrictions, her handwriting small, neat, and unshaken. I will obey the terms required to protect Whitmore House, but I will not beg for kindness, affection, or mercy. When she finished, she set the pen down. Ethan stared at the line. His face remained controlled, but something in his eyes altered, a faint disturbance beneath ice. That addition has no legal force. Neither does dignity, apparently, yet people keep pretending it matters. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he took the pen and signed his name beneath hers. Ethan James Hawthorne. The ink shone wet and black in the firelight. Clara felt no relief. Only the strange, hollow weight of having survived the first door of a house built entirely of doors. The Duke sanded the signatures, folded the contract, and locked it in the top drawer of his desk. There is one rule not written there, he said. Clara turned back from the fire. Only one. The east wing is closed. You will not enter it. Something in his voice had changed. Not louder, not colder, more guarded. Clara glanced toward the dark windows where snow tapped softly against the glass. What is in the east wing? Nothing that concerns you. In my experience, Your Grace, people only forbid empty rooms when they are not empty at all. His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Then let your experience protect you from curiosity. Clara met his gaze, tired, chilled, and newly bound to a stranger's house by ink and debt. I was sold for my silence tonight, she said. Do not expect me to surrender my questions for free. Morning arrived at Blackridge Hall without warmth. It came as a thin gray light pressing through the tall windows, turning the frost on the glass into pale veins and the marble floors into sheets of dull ice. Clara had slept little in the west room, not because the bed was uncomfortable, for it was the finest bed she had ever been given, but because comfort offered by captivity had a way of feeling borrowed from someone else's sorrow. The room smelled faintly of cedar, lavender, and old smoke. A fire had been laid before she entered, fresh towels placed beside a porcelain basin, and a dark wool dress folded across the chair with the careful efficiency of servants trained to make mercy look like procedure. She wore her own gown instead. It was plain, travel-worn, and still faintly creased from the trunk, but it belonged to her. That mattered more than warmth. At breakfast, the dining room stretched around her like a cathedral built for appetite no one possessed. Ethan Hawthorne sat at the far end of the long table, reading correspondence beside a silver coffee service. He did not look up when she entered. A place had been set for her halfway down the table, neither honored nor dismissed, positioned exactly where calculation had decided she should be. Clara sat, unfolded her napkin, and waited. The footman poured coffee. Another servant placed eggs, toast, and stewed apples before her. She thanked each of them by name after hearing the butler address them once. The younger footman blinked as if gratitude had startled him. The Duke noticed that. He noticed everything. You need not memorize the staff, he said without lowering the letter. They are not part of your obligation. Clara lifted her coffee cup. Kindness does not become expensive because it is unnecessary. His eyes rose then, cool and unreadable across the length of polished mahogany. You speak as though you can afford it. I have found it is often all people can afford. Silence settled between them. Not empty silence. Listening silence. The kind that gathers around words after they have struck their mark. Clara ate only a few bites, though hunger folded sharply through her. Pride was foolish, she knew that. Pride did not warm hands, or pay debts, or soften locked doors. Still, when every possession had been measured, signed away, and carried elsewhere, pride became the last room no creditor could enter unless invited. After breakfast, she asked Mrs. Vale, the housekeeper, whether there was work she might do. The older woman stared at her as if Clara had requested to rearrange the moon. Miss Whitmore, guests do not work. Am I a guest? Mrs. Vale hesitated. His Grace has not used another word. Then I shall use one for myself. Useful. By noon, Clara had found the small household linen room in disorder, not from neglect, but from age. She folded sheets, mended a torn pillowcase, and relabeled shelves where ink had faded beyond reading. By 2 o'clock, she had helped an elderly maid named Agnes carry coal scuttles from the service passage after noticing the woman pause to rub her wrist. By 4, she stood in the abandoned chapel at the back of the west corridor, wiping dust from a row of wooden pews while winter light pooled blue across the floor. The chapel had not been loved in years. Its candles had burned down to hardened stubs, its hymnals smelled of damp paper, and the small stained-glass window above the altar was clouded with grime. Clara found a clean cloth, a basin, and patience. She had no money, no liberty, and no guarantee of mercy, but she still possessed hands. So she used them. From the upper gallery, unseen behind the carved screen, Ethan watched her light the first fresh candle. The flame trembled, then steadied, gilding the curve of her cheek, and the pale strands of hair loosened from her pins. She was not performing virtue for an audience. She believed herself alone. That disturbed him more than tears would have. Tears demanded response. Quiet dignity demanded judgment, and not of her. Later, when Clara returned to the linen room, she found a folded shawl waiting on the chair, dark blue, thick, and newly warmed. No note accompanied it. No servant admitted placing it there. She touched the wool with chilled fingers and understood enough. Across the corridor, Ethan passed without stopping. "Blackridge is drafty," he said. Clara lifted the shawl but did not put it on until he had nearly reached the stairs. "Thank you, Your Grace." His steps paused. It was not a gift. She looked at his back, at the rigid line of his shoulders beneath the black coat. "Of course not," she said softly. "That would have required kindness." He continued walking, but slower than before. By the third evening, Clara had learned that Blackridge Hall did not sleep. It listened. The walls carried the low groan of winter wind, the settling sigh of old timber, the whisper of servants' shoes vanishing around corners before she could learn which passages were permitted and which only pretended to be. She had spent the day in small acts that belonged to no contract, reading aloud to Agnes while the woman rested her sore wrist, organizing the chapel candles, and returning 3 estate ledgers she found misplaced in the library. No one thanked her openly. Gratitude in Blackridge seemed to move like smoke, visible only when caught by light. Near 9 o'clock, after Mrs. Vale had retired and the lower halls had grown quiet, Clara heard music. Not from the drawing room, where a piano sat covered in gray linen. Not from the chapel, where silence seemed to kneel permanently before the altar. It came from the eastern side of the house, faint and wavering, a few notes of a hymn played on strings, so fragile that at first she thought the wind had found some sorrowful crack in the stone and taught it to sing. She stood in the west corridor with a candle in one hand and the blue shawl over her shoulders, listening until the melody returned. For notes. A pause. For notes again. Her mother had once owned a music box that played the same tune. Clara knew this not from memory, but from a servant's story told years ago while packing away the last pieces of Evelyn Whitmore's room. The knowledge moved through her like a hand placed gently between her shoulders. The east wing is closed. The Duke's warning rose at once, cold and exact. Clara looked down the hall where the permitted lamps burned steady, then toward the darker passage beyond the carved archway. No servant stood guard. No lock barred the way. The prohibition had been left to conscience, which meant Ethan Hawthorne had overestimated either her obedience or his own power over questions. Clara crossed the threshold. The air changed immediately. It was colder there, not with the ordinary chill of unused rooms, but with the preserved cold of places kept from life on purpose. Dust softened the carpet. Portraits lined the walls beneath white covers, their shapes pale and faceless in the candlelight. The music had stopped, yet she followed the memory of it past a closed sitting room, past a nursery with its door tied shut by a strip of black ribbon, and finally to a narrow gallery where moonlight spilled through cracked shutters. At the end of the gallery stood a large portrait covered in ivory cloth. Clara should have turned back. She knew it. Her hand even tightened around the candle as if ready to retreat. Then the wind pressed through the broken shutter, lifted the cloth, and let it fall away. The woman in the portrait looked down at her with Clara's own eyes. Not similar eyes. Not the polite resemblance families claimed when grief needed comfort. The same gray-blue gaze, the same small line between the brows, the same pale hair touched with gold near the temples. Lady Evelyn Whitmore, younger than Clara had ever imagined her, stood painted in a gown of deep green, one hand resting on a silver ribbon clasp identical to the one Clara carried in her pocket. The candle in Clara's hand trembled. Wax slid over her glove, warm and sudden, but she did not feel it. Her mother's portrait hung in the forbidden wing of Blackridge Hall, not in some forgotten corner, but framed in dark gilt, and placed where someone had once come to look at it often. Step away from that. Ethan's voice cut through the gallery. Clara turned. He stood at the far end of the corridor, no coat, no gloves, his face stripped of the careful cold he wore like armor. Anger was there, yes, but beneath it was something far more dangerous. Fear. Why is my mother here? Clara asked. He walked toward her, each step controlled with visible effort. You were told not to enter this wing, and you were asked what it contained. This does not concern you. Clara let out one quiet breath, almost a laugh, almost a wound. My mother's face is on your wall, Your Grace. Try again. Ethan stopped close enough for the candlelight to show the color had left his face. His eyes moved once to the portrait, then back to Clara, as if seeing both at once cost him something. Where did you get that clasp? He asked. Clara's free hand went to her pocket. It was hers. Show me. No. The single word struck harder than if she had raised her voice. Ethan's jaw tightened. For a moment, the Frost Duke looked less like a man commanding a house than one trapped inside it with all the doors locked from the past. Clara stepped between him and the portrait, small, pale, and shaking only because the candle would not be still. You purchased my father's debt. You brought me here under terms I did not choose. You forbade this wing. Now I find my mother waiting in it. Her voice lowered. Tell me why. Ethan looked at Evelyn Whitmore's painted face, and when he answered, his voice had lost its edge. Because she was the only person my father ever begged forgiveness from. For several seconds, Clara heard nothing but the small, unsteady sound of her own breathing and the winter wind pressing its fingers against the shutters. Ethan's words remained in the gallery like smoke that would not rise. Because she was the only person my father ever begged forgiveness from. Clara looked from him to the portrait and back again, searching his face for mockery, calculation, anything she could reject cleanly. She found neither. The Frost Duke stood beneath his mother's house of shadows with all his command intact and none of his certainty. Your father knew my mother, Clara said. Everyone who mattered knew Lady Evelyn Whitmore, he replied. But the answer came too quickly, too neatly, and both of them heard the evasion. Clara touched the silver clasp in her pocket without removing it. That is not what I asked. Ethan turned away first. The gesture was small, but in a man built of restraint, it felt like a confession. This wing was my mother's before she died. Afterward, my father sealed certain rooms and moved certain portraits here. He did not explain himself to me. He rarely explained anything. Yet you kept her portrait uncovered enough to know where it was. I kept everything exactly as he left it. That is not the same as innocence. His eyes returned to her, sharp again, though the sharpness lacked strength. No, it is not. Before Clara could answer, footsteps approached from the far corridor, hurried but disciplined. Mrs. Vale appeared at the archway, her gray hair pinned beneath her nightcap, a candle held close to her chest. Behind her stood the butler, Mr. Alden, carrying a silver tray with a card upon it. Both servants froze at the sight of Clara in the forbidden gallery, Ethan beside her, and Evelyn Whitmore watching from the wall. Your Grace, Mr. Alden said carefully, forgive the interruption. A gentleman has arrived at the outer gate. He refuses to wait until morning. Ethan did not look away from Clara. Who? Mr. Alden stepped closer and offered the card. Thomas Reed, attorney at law. He says he represented the late Lady Evelyn Whitmore, and that his business concerns Miss Clara Whitmore directly. The name struck the air with a force no one acknowledged aloud. Clara knew it faintly. Thomas Reed had been spoken of once at Whitmore House, years ago, when Margaret believed Clara too young to understand adult irritation. An old lawyer with old papers, her stepmother had said, and then the subject had vanished beneath a closed door. Ethan took the card. Something changed in his expression as he read the handwritten message on the reverse. Not surprise. Recognition. Bring him to my study, he said. At once. Mrs. Vale glanced at Clara's pale face. Miss Whitmore, shall I escort you back to your room? No, Clara said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried down the gallery. If his business concerns me, I will hear it. Ethan looked as though he might refuse, then seemed to remember that refusal had begun to lose its authority in this house. Very well. They returned to the study in silence. The halls felt different now, not merely old, but aware. Clara walked with the blue shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, the silver clasp warm in her pocket from the pressure of her hand. When they entered the study, The fire had burned low, painting the bookshelves in a restless amber glow. Ethan stood behind his desk, but Clara did not take the chair offered near the hearth. She stood beside the window where frost clouded the glass, because standing had become the only form of control left to her. Thomas Reed arrived 10 minutes later, bringing the smell of snow and road dust with him. He was a thin man in his 60s, with white hair beneath a dark hat and eyes that looked tired from carrying truth too far. He bowed first to Ethan, then more deeply to Clara. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice softened. "You have your mother's face." Clara swallowed. "Did you know her well?" "Well enough to fail her." The room grew very still. Mr. Reed placed a small silver box on the desk. It was tarnished, tied with a faded green ribbon, and sealed with red wax stamped not with the Whitmore crest, but with the old mark of Blackridge. Ethan's hand moved toward it, then stopped. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "From Lady Evelyn herself. 3 weeks before her death. She instructed me to deliver it to her daughter when Clara reached 21, unless the Blackridge family made contact first." Clara's heart tightened. "I am 23. Pain crossed the old lawyer's face. "Yes. Your stepmother denied every request I made to see you. When I learned yesterday that your father's debt had been transferred here, I came at once." Ethan broke the seal with a paper knife, but it was Clara who untied the ribbon. Inside lay several folded pages, a miniature portrait of a young man Clara did not recognize, and a letter addressed in her mother's hand. "To my daughter, Clara, if Blackridge ever calls your name before it calls its debt." Her fingers trembled then, not from cold. Ethan saw it and stepped back, giving her space as if space were the first apology he knew how to offer. Clara opened the letter. The ink had browned with age, but the words remained clear. "My darling child, if this reaches you, then the promise made to me has either been forgotten or betrayed. Years ago, I saved the house of Hawthorne from disgrace, and in return, Arthur Hawthorne swore before God and witness that no daughter of mine would ever stand unprotected while Blackridge had a roof, a name, or a dollar to its power." Clara read the sentence once. Then again, the study seemed to tilt around her. Ethan's face had gone white. Mr. Reed removed another paper from the box and laid it before him. A signed oath. Arthur Hawthorne's name at the bottom. Evelyn Whitmore's beside it. And beneath both, in smaller writing, the terms of guardianship, protection, inheritance restoration, and a trust of $40,000 Clara had never seen. Ethan stared at his father's signature as though the dead had reached through paper and placed a hand on his throat. "My father owed her protection," he said. Mr. Reed's voice was grave. "More than that, Your Grace. Blackridge owed her daughter freedom." Clara looked at Ethan then, and for the first time since entering his house, she saw the full collapse of the distance between them. Not gone, but cracked from floor to ceiling. He was no longer only the man who had purchased her family's debt. He was the son of a man who had buried her mother's promise and let Clara be delivered to his door like payment. The fire hissed softly. Outside, snow tapped the window like 1,000 unanswered letters. Ethan lowered his eyes to the oath, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Leave us." Mr. Reed bowed and withdrew. The door closed. Clara remained by the window, the letter open in her hand. Ethan did not move for a long time. Then he reached into the drawer, took out the contract she had signed, and placed it beside his father's oath. 2 papers, 2 truths, 1 shame. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and the title sounded different now, stripped of possession. "I did not know." Clara's eyes burned, but no tears fell. "That has been the privilege of every person who harmed me." Clara left the study before Ethan could mistake silence for forgiveness. She carried her mother's letter against her chest as though the thin pages contained not ink, but a pulse she had been denied all her life. No one stopped her. Not Ethan, who stood behind his desk with his father's oath before him like a sentence. Not Mr. Alden, who waited in the corridor with lowered eyes. Not Mrs. Vale, who pressed one hand to her heart and stepped aside as Clara passed. The house seemed to hold its breath around her. She did not return to the West Room. Something in her knew that a bedroom, however fine, would make her grief too private, and this grief had been hidden long enough. She walked through the darkened corridors until she reached the little chapel she had cleaned only the day before. The candle she had lit still burned near the altar, smaller now, but alive. Clara knelt on the cold wooden step, not because she felt holy, and not because she knew what to ask of heaven, but because her knees had carried too many revelations in one night and could carry no more. Dawn had not yet arrived. Beyond the stained glass window, the world remained blue-black and snowbound. She unfolded the letter again. My darling child. The words blurred, steadied, blurred again. Evelyn Whitmore had not abandoned her. That truth should have comforted Clara, yet it opened a deeper wound. Her mother had tried. Her mother had planned. Her mother had left a promise strong enough to cross death, and still Clara had grown up hungry for protection inside a house that spent her like spare change. Footsteps sounded at the chapel door. Clara did not turn. She knew his pace now, measured and restrained, though tonight each step seemed heavier, as if Ethan Hawthorne had finally discovered the weight of his own name. He stopped several feet behind her. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence was no longer his weapon. It was his punishment. Miss Whitmore, he said at last. Clara kept her eyes on the candle. If you have come to explain, Your Grace, choose your words carefully. I have heard many explanations from people who hoped language could dress betrayal in better clothes. His breath moved through the cold air, slow and uneven. I have not come to explain. Something soft touched the step beside her. Not his hand. Paper. Clara looked down and saw the contract she had signed on her first night at Blackridge. Beneath it lay the oath of Arthur Hawthorne, the forgotten promise, and a new document bearing Ethan's seal. The debt is dissolved, he said. Every dollar, every claim, every condition. Whitmore House remains untouched until a lawful settlement can be made in your name, not your father's, and the trust my father buried will be restored with interest. Clara closed her fingers around the letter in her lap. That is justice on paper. It is the beginning of it. His voice was lower now, stripped of command. It should have been done before you crossed my threshold. It should have been done before your stepmother ever learned she could use my name against you. It should have been done while my father still lived, and when he failed, I should have known enough of his sins to repair them before they found you. Clara turned then. Ethan stood in the aisle, tall beneath the chapel shadows, his face pale with a kind of ruin no winter could cause. The Frost Duke looked older in that hour, not by years, but by truth. He removed the signet ring from his right hand, the black stone crest catching the candlelight, and placed it on the altar step between them. Then, slowly, he lowered himself to one knee on the cold floor. Clara's breath caught, but she did not move. This was not a proposal. There was no romance in it, no soft music, no stolen tenderness to make the moment pretty. It was something more difficult. A powerful man placing himself beneath the weight of what had been done and refusing, at last, to stand above it. Blackridge owes you everything, Ethan said. Protection, restitution, truth. And if you never forgive this house, I will not insult you by asking. The first gray light of dawn touched the stained glass, turning the chapel floor faintly gold around him. Clara looked at him kneeling where she had knelt, feeling the same cold rise through polished stone, and for the first time, she did not feel small in his presence. She felt witnessed. Do not kneel because you are ashamed, she said softly. Shame passes when people grow tired of feeling it. Ethan lifted his eyes. Then tell me what to do. Clara stood, the letter held against her heart. Stand, she said, and prove that your father's promise did not die with my mother. By the time Ethan rose, dawn had entered the chapel fully, pale and quiet, laying its light across the altar, the old pews, the letter in Clara's hand, and the signet ring still resting on the step between them. Neither of them reached for it at first. Some objects require a person to become worthy before they can be worn again. Ethan seemed to understand that, because he left the ring where it was and stood with his hands at his sides, no longer the master of Blackridge Hall in that moment, but a man waiting to learn the shape of repair. Clara folded her mother's letter with careful fingers. She had expected freedom, if it ever came, to feel like a door flung open, air rushing in, the whole world calling her away from the place that had held her. Instead, it felt heavier than captivity. Freedom required choice, and choice was a terrifying thing to someone who had been passed from debt to duty, as if her life were a ledger with margins too narrow for hope. The carriage will be prepared whenever you wish, Ethan said. His voice was steady again, though not cold. Mr. Reed can accompany you back to Whitmore House. Mrs. Vale will pack whatever you need. No one will prevent you from leaving. Clara looked toward the chapel window, where the stained glass had begun to glow in muted red and blue. "And if I leave this morning? Then I will send the legal papers behind you, transfer the restored trust into your control, and remove your father and stepmother from any authority over your inheritance." "And if I stay until tonight?" Ethan's eyes lifted to hers. He did not answer too quickly this time. "Then you stay as a free woman under my roof, and I will regard every moment of it as more grace than Blackridge deserves." The honesty of that hurt more than arrogance would have. Clara turned from him before her face could reveal too much. She had spent 3 nights in this house hating its walls for watching her. Now she understood they had watched others before her. Evelyn Whitmore, Arthur Hawthorne, perhaps even Ethan as a boy, learning silence from rooms where adults buried truth and called it order. "I want the East Wing opened," Clara said. "All of it." Ethan nodded once. "It will be done, not by servants alone, by you." A faint shadow crossed his face, but he did not look away. "Yes." They walked there together an hour later, with Mrs. Vale following at a distance and Mr. Alden carrying keys that had not been used in years. The East Wing received daylight reluctantly. Curtains were drawn back one by one. Dust lifted in pale clouds. Furniture emerged from sheets like memories reluctant to be recognized. In a sitting room overlooking the frozen garden, Clara found her mother's music box on a small rosewood table. Its silver crank resisted at first, then turned beneath Ethan's hand. The same 4 notes filled the room, fragile and uneven, but alive. Clara sat beside the table, her breath caught somewhere between grief and wonder. "She came here often?" she asked. Ethan stood near the mantel, reading an old inventory as if it might shield him. "I do not know how often. I only know my father ordered this room sealed after her death. He said it contained obligations that had become impossible to honor." "Obligations do not become impossible," Clara said. "People become unwilling." Ethan accepted the correction with a small lowering of his head. In the next room, they found diaries wrapped in linen, not all Evelyn's, but several bearing her hand. Clara spent the afternoon reading by the window while snow softened the garden beyond the glass. Ethan did not crowd her. He stood when she needed a box lifted, answered when she asked a question, and remained silent when the pages demanded it. Slowly, the woman in the portrait became more than a face. Evelyn had been witty, fierce, lonely in the way dignified women were often forced to be. She had written of Clara as an infant with such tenderness that Clara had to stop twice and press the page against her lips. Near evening, she found the final entry. "If Clara ever stands in Blackridge, let her stand unbent. Let no Hawthorne mistake mercy for ownership." She read it aloud. The words settled over the room like a blessing and an indictment. Ethan closed his eyes. When he opened them, Clara was watching him. "I am not ready to forgive you," she said. "I know. I am not ready to trust you. I know that too. But I will stay tonight." His breath changed, almost imperceptibly. "Why?" Clara looked back at the diary, at her mother's name, at the music box still open on the table. "Because leaving with the truth before I understand it would only make me another person running from this house." Outside, twilight gathered blue against the windows. Inside, for the first time in years, the East Wing held candlelight. Ethan moved toward the door to give her privacy, but Clara's voice stopped him. "Your Grace." He turned. "Tomorrow, we go to Whitmore House." The Frost Duke's expression settled into something colder than anger and steadier than regret. "Yes," he said. "Tomorrow, they answer to you." Morning came hard and clear, with sunlight flashing over the snowfields as the Blackridge carriage rolled south toward Whitmore House. Clara sat facing forward, her mother's letter tucked safely inside her coat, her hands resting open in her lap for the first time since the night she had left home. Ethan sat across from her, dressed in black as always, but the severity of him had changed. It no longer seemed like a wall built to keep the world beneath him. It seemed like armor he had finally realized could wound others simply by remaining in place. Mr. Reed rode in the second carriage with the documents, the restored trust, the dissolved debt, and every paper necessary to remove Clara's life from the hands that had bartered it. No one spoke for the first 10 miles. The wheels cut through packed snow. Bare trees passed in solemn rows. Clara watched the familiar countryside return, fence by fence, hill by hill, until the shape of Whitmore House appeared beyond the sycamores like a memory She no longer knew whether to mourn or condemn. The house looked smaller in daylight, poorer. Its white paint had peeled along the columns. The front steps sagged at one corner, and smoke rose weakly from only one chimney. Ethan looked at it through the window with an expression Clara could not fully read. "This is where they sent you from," he said. "This is where they kept me," Clara answered. The carriage stopped. Before the footman could open the door, Clara placed a hand lightly against Ethan's sleeve, not to seek support, to halt his certainty. "You will not speak for me unless I ask you to." His eyes lowered to her hand, then lifted to her face. "Understood. And you will not frighten them for sport." "I do not take sport in cowards." The answer was cold enough to be almost satisfying, but Clara only nodded and stepped down. The front door opened before they reached it. Margaret Whitmore appeared in the entryway in a dress of faded burgundy silk, her expression shifting from annoyance to calculation the instant she saw the Blackridge carriage. Behind her stood Henry Whitmore, pale and unshaven, one hand braced against the wall, as if the house itself were the only thing holding him upright. "Clara," Margaret said, recovering quickly. "We did not expect you so soon." "No," Clara replied. "I imagine you expected me to remain wherever I was placed." Margaret's eyes flicked to Ethan and softened into false civility. "Your Grace, what an honor. I trust our arrangement has proven satisfactory." Ethan did not bow. He did not smile. He waited. Clara felt that restraint beside her like a drawn curtain. Mr. Reed came up the steps then, carrying the leather case, and Margaret's face tightened at the sight of him. "That man has no business here." "On the contrary," Clara said. "He has had business here for 2 years. You refused to receive him." Henry closed his eyes. Margaret's chin lifted. "Whatever papers he carries are old and irrelevant." "Old, yes." Clara removed her mother's letter from her coat. "Irrelevant, no." They gathered in the dining room, the same room where Clara had signed herself away. The cold hearth remained empty. The same portraits watched from the walls. The table had been cleared of candles and contracts, but Clara could still see the place where the pen had lain. Mr. Reed laid out the documents one by one. Arthur Hawthorne's oath, Evelyn Whitmore's trust, the record of denied correspondence, the dissolved debt, and the notice transferring authority over the restored funds to Clara alone. Each sheet landed softly, yet Margaret flinched as though paper had weight enough to crush. "This is absurd," she said. "The girl has no understanding of estate matters." Clara looked at her stepmother with a calm that surprised even herself. "That has been convenient for you." Margaret turned to Ethan. "Your Grace, surely you will not allow a household to be overturned by the sentimental claims of a dead woman." The room changed. Not loudly. No one moved. Yet something in the air went still and dark. Ethan placed one gloved hand on the back of Clara's chair, not touching her, not claiming her, only marking where he stood. "Careful, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Every word against her is now a word Blackridge will answer." Margaret's mouth closed. Henry sank into a chair, his face collapsing with the helpless grief of a man who had mistaken weakness for innocence. "Clara," he whispered, "I did not know it had gone so far." Clara looked at him for a long time. The little girl in her wanted that sentence to matter. The woman standing in the morning light knew it did not matter enough. "You knew when you looked away?" she said. He had no answer. By noon, the papers were signed. By 1, Margaret had retreated upstairs in silence, and Henry had agreed to the legal oversight Mr. Reed required. Whitmore House no longer owned Clara's future. Neither did Blackridge. When she stepped outside, sunlight touched the snow so brightly that she had to close her eyes for a moment. Ethan stood a few feet behind her, leaving space as he always should have. "Where will you go?" he asked. Clara looked back at the house, then toward the road leading north. "I do not know yet. Blackridge remains open to you. Not as debt, not as duty." She turned to him. The Frost Duke stood before her with all his power restrained, waiting for permission to become something better than what his name had been. Clara did not offer forgiveness. Not yet. But she offered truth. "Then keep it open with honesty." His voice softened. "Always." Snow began to fall again, light and slow, no longer a storm, but a hush over the wounded earth. Clara stepped into the carriage by her own choice, carrying her mother's letter, her restored name, and the first fragile knowledge that freedom was not the end of sorrow. It was the beginning of deciding which doors deserved to remain open. Some hearts do not heal when they are rescued. They heal when they are finally allowed to stand unowned in the light.